Thank you. I would like to begin by greeting the chairperson, my fellow panelists, and the audience, and thanking the organizers for letting me present in a international symposium on South Asia. South Asia is of particular interest to or to students of linguistics, because in linguistics we treat South Asia as a kind of a unit or a coherent region. And that is mainly because of the extensive levels of multilingualism found in the region. So when linguistically one talks about South Asia, the idea which immediately comes to the mind is multilingualism, and the attitudes generally over the centuries, the attitudes towards multilingualism in this region has been a positive attitude. People have developed cultures and have found ways of adding linguistic varieties to their kitty without really compromising upon their mother tongues. So learning a new language or a new language entering the region was never seen as a kind of competition or a kind of invasion of space, but an additional resource which people learned. And as a result, throughout South Asia, people are have used different linguistic varieties at home, at work, amongst friends, in the market, to entertain ourselves, in rituals. We use different languages, different linguistic varieties, and that to our mind is not something very special or it's a mundane thing, right? It's an everyday thing. But in as linguists have studied linguistic cultures across the world, it is a very special. We have realized that this is a very special characteristic of South Asia, not very common across the world. There are some regions of that kind, but it's not very common. And these behaviors and these attitudes towards multilingualism have brought about a different conception. For example, of what it means to know a language. For example, we very commonly hear people saying, I understand 80% of language X. What does this sentence even mean? You either know a language or you don't know a language, right? But people they have such a positive attitude that if they understand, and what they realize is that to know a language or to engage with a language is not to know the language in all its manifestations, but that engagement would start as a partial engagement, and as the need arises, one learns the language in the streets, in the market. And this idea that we do not need to engage with the language in all its manifestation is very typical of a South Asian multilingual. Okay, and this culture, this has become a kind of cultural disposition of South Asians, of engaging with different linguistic varieties. Along with this cultural disposition comes a willingness to interact with the person before you on a sort of a neutral ground. It is very rare to find a South Asian, who insist on engaging on. So if I'm a speaker of Marathi, I will only speak to in Marathi. If we meet a person of another language, we try to meet the person on a neutral ground, or if there is no neutral ground, we try with some kind of gestures, but we always try to communicate. There is no breakdown of communication in spite of these. So we have found a way around dealing with linguistic varieties, and whenever there is a possibility of these varieties causing a problem, we have solved the problem by creating newer varieties, which we call as the link languages or the Bazari languages, that sort of stuff. Now, this is not only a matter of practice, but it has affected our languages too. And our languages have become quite like each other. We know that when people stay together, we often say that people who stay together for a long time start looking like each other. It's a common thing. It may, I don't know how true that is, but it's an observation. In the same way, languages of South Asia have become like each other in their grammatical properties. So many languages of, take for example, Indo-Aryan languages. So we have 5 language families. So the Indo-Aryan language is one major family. We have retroflexes in the Indo-Aryan languages. No other Indo-European language has retroflexes. From where have they come? They have come to us Indo-Aryan speakers from the Dravidian languages. The Munda languages have retroflexes. So I can list quite a few examples. Another example which immediately comes to our mind is the use of, repetitive use of a word like thoda thoda, jaldi jaldi, gali gali, for a distributional reading. So thoda thoda, thoda thoda aage badho. So it's a step by step go ahead. Now this property is a Dravidian property which is found across South Asia. Okay, so languages have converged, they have become like each other, and what I wish to say is that so much so that even while speaking English, we use this. It's not a good construction in English, right? This is so soft. This is so soft. This room is so pink. I have heard people say that. So we are now changing properties of English, and English is now converging with languages of South Asia. So this dynamics of language is something which is very valuable and something which which other people from other regions are very curious to know about, to learn about, and how do Indians or how do South Asians manage to preserve this level of linguistic diversity. Now, this is a picture which I have painted across the 2 millennia of records we have, but in recent times, things have been changing, and in the recent decades, they have been changing more rapidly than we would have liked. And they have changed to such an extent today that the majority of the debate around our mother tongues is about how can we save our mother tongues. And by all estimates, very reasonable estimates, I would say, that we are in almost about to lose 90% of our mother tongue by the end of this century. It is a real possibility. The social space of a mother tongue has been shrinking very rapidly. Now the question is, why did this happen? Given what we have just talked about, the positive attitude, why in recent times, why this process started somewhere around the 18th, 19th century, but now it has become almost a kind of an avalanche, or a kind of a genocide of our mother tongues. The reason for this drastic change needs to be looked into, and I'm sure, as we might imagine, these reasons are very complex and there is no very straightforward formulaic kind of answer. What I wish to do in this paper, in my presentation, is to bring forth a particular dimension of this change in fortunes of our mother tongues, which I feel has not been given due attention in our discussions about the future of our mother tongue. We do talk about language loss, language endangerment, but we do not relate it to the ways in which we have conceptualized our linguistic diversity. How do we think about our linguistic diversity? What does linguistic diversity really mean for us? The underlying assumption of my presentation is that human knowledges, practices, and beliefs influence and are in turn influenced by the socio-cultural climate they are part of. So there is something that has changed in our socio-cultural climate, which is now exerting a lot of pressure on our linguistic diversity. Now, in this paper, I have drawn examples from languages or linguistic situations which I have examined as a student of linguistics. So it is a very it's a very personal kind of. I draw from personal experiences as a researcher. But the claim which I make, or the generalization which I wish to make, is, I think, applicable across South Asia. Whatever I have read about South Asia, people generally, I think, whatever I wish to present can be applicable. So one way to counter my argument would be to pick up any example of South Asia which does not follow the pattern which I wish to present before you. So in this presentation, I wish to bring forth two interrelated issues. One, what would constitute an appropriate conceptualization of linguistic diversity and multilingual practices? And second, what effect does a monolingual perspective of language have on multilingual practices developed in the subcontinent over the centuries? So if we adopt a monolingual approach, if we look at a diversity from a monolingual perspective, what effect does it have on the practices? And how do we think about the practices in a way that we can build a sustainable environment for a mother tongue. The immediate context is, of course, the shrinking space of a mother tongue, but also a part of our discussion about language has been two orientations opposite in their focus, or opposite orientations to our mother tongue. So one orientation is about rejecting the linguistic traditions of a mother tongue, or the traditions which a mother tongue represents. So there have been articulation by a certain section of Dalit intellectuals, most prominently. They articulate that we should reject mother tongue education in favor of English-based education. Building temples of God is English, celebration of Macaulay's birthday are really manifestations of this trend. Now, this is part of an overall pattern. It is not just Dalit intellectuals, but they have put it forward with a lot of emphasis. So I'm just using their examples. What they argue is that mother tongues represent a tradition which is steeped, very deeply steeped in caste and gender discriminatory practices. And because of that, because of this background of our mother tongues, they offer very little hope to a large section of our native speakers. This tradition represents for them a tradition of discrimination, repression, and rejecting mother tongue in the favor of English is thereby an attempt to overthrow this oppressive socio-cultural practices of the past. That is one way of approaching mother tongue. There is another orientation, a seemingly opposite orientation, which looks at mother tongues as like a primordial identity, as an identity you get by birth, around which socio-political mobilizations can be made. A typical strategy in this orientation is to locate the glory of the user of the mother tongue in the past. We were great once, we were kings once, we were landlords once, whatever their idea of greatness may be, and blame their current poor state on marginalization of the community at a later stage in history. So what is the idea? Restoration of the past glory and prominence of the community serves as a rallying point for the members of the community. It is quite common to observe a clamor, almost a clamor for greater visibility in the corridors of power, with the hope that this visibility would result in greater allocations of resources for the community. So now we observe that communities are in competition with each other for allocation of economic resources, which are meager in any way, but whatever resources are available, our community should get more or less, whatever. Now, this demand takes various shapes. For example, there are demands of recognition as a language as opposed to dialects. So the government of India classifies various varieties as dialects. So a lot of communities demand that their linguistic variety should be recognized as a full-fledged language or a dialect of a particular language. Successful examples include examples of Konkani, Maithili, and there are many other quote-unquote dialects which are still making those demands. Bhojpuri is an excellent example. Another kind of demand is the demand to be included in the 8th schedule of the Constitution. As you all might know, the 8th schedule of the Indian Constitution lists a number of languages which are recognized and patronized by the government in the form of financial allocations. When we were in the 1950s, there were 14 languages which were included in the 8th schedule. Still on our currency notes, those languages are mentioned. Today, it's 22 languages. So we have grown from 14 to 22. 8 languages have been included in the 8th schedule at a later stage. There are many languages which demand this kind of inclusion in the 8th schedule. Banjara language in Maharashtra is a demand which I have closely seen. I have been asked to comment on it, so I know what kind of demand they are making. They wish to be included. They wish that Banjara be included in the 8th schedule list. There is another kind of demand for recognition as a classical language. Now, this is a very recent thing that we are a classical language. We are language with and with extensive antiquity. As a linguist or a student of linguistics, I don't understand what is this old language and new languages. I don't know of any new language. All language. How do we know how old a language is? I really don't know. It is all about written records and availability of written records. But anyway, so this is a major demand, and it started with Tamil. Later, Sanskrit was added, and today Telugu, Malayalam, Kannada, Odia. These are all recognized as classical languages. Marathi is trying very hard to be part of this exclusive list. What is the basic idea? You get allocations for development of the language. So these demands, as you may observe, are they differ in scope, but their orientation is what I have really talked about, that you use it as a tool of socio-political mobilization. Now, given this context of public discourse, the question related to conceptualization of language gives us a vantage point to understand the nature of the linguistic crisis we are facing, not only in India, but I think across South Asia. And also, more importantly, discover the common ground from which these different orientations emerge. So these orientations may be opposite. The orientation, these demands may have opposite orientations. But what I would like to discuss and put forward before you all are that they share the same ground. They derive the nourishment from the same kind of dynamics. So they are not as different as they look to be. But before we get a grasp over the issues outlined, let me first discuss what the expanse of the notion of linguistic diversity really is. Now, the word diversity is a transdisciplinary notion. We talk about diversity in the natural world. We talk about diversity in the social world. We have diverse biosystems. We have diverse societies, diverse cultures, diverse languages. So what I intend to do is use our understanding of biodiversity to explain the nature and the depth of linguistic diversity. Because I really feel that linguistic diversity, there's a very shallow understanding of what really linguistic diversity means. So when we talk about biodiversity, we talk about biodiversity at three levels. Generally people talk about biodiversity at the level of species. So there are many species of plants and animals, and that region is the level of biodiversity in the region is the measurement of the level of the number of species in that region. But along with the species, within species, the amount of genetic diversity which exists is also equally important. Right. So if human species, we say that we should marry across cultures, because then we increase our genetic diversity. If you marry in a very close group, our genetic diversity decreases. So diversity within the species is equally important. And above the species, the diversity of ecosystem, different kind of ecosystems which exist in a region. So when we're talking about diversity, we need to talk about diversity of ecosystem, diversity of species, and diversity of diversity, which is genetic diversity. And only when we look at this in a very holistic manner that we get an idea of the notion of biodiversity. In the same way, most of the discussions around linguistic diversity is about diversity of language. How many languages are spoken in the region? There is very little talk about diversity within the language. I'm not talking about dialects and sub-dialects. So suppose I speak a particular dialect of Marathi, then what are the various resources available within that dialect as a user? Are we increasing those resources or are we decreasing the resources? That will give us a very fair account of the vitality of the language, how vigorous that language is. Of course, importantly, equally importantly, diversity, various linguistic ecosystems. South Asia is made up of various linguistic ecosystems which do not coincide with administrative boundaries. And we have had a lot of conflict, a lot of stress, cultural, social stress, because we have imposed administrative boundaries on what is essentially a contiguous area. South Asia, why do we talk about South Asia? Because we look at it as a contiguous area. And unfortunately, linguistic surveys or any cultural surveys, they follow administrative boundaries for understandable reasons, but then these surveys break the continuities which we observe. So, users, we all in this virtual classroom are multilingual users. We all speak more than one language. I don't know everybody, but I can guarantee it, because we are all, I have not met a human being who's a monolingual. Okay, and our linguistic repertoire consists of diversity at all these levels. So when we talk about diversity, we have to talk about diversity at all these levels. Only focusing on how many languages is a very reductive way of. For example, diversity in ecosystem. A very interesting question is that, so if there's a person from the Konkan region, which is the belt along South Asia, starting from Maharashtra right up to Kerala, more likely than not that, and if there's a person from the Hindi belt, the person from the Konkan belt could be much more multilingual than the person from the Hindi belt. Multilingualism in Konkan region is very, very high as compared to multilingualism in Bengal, multilingualism in the Hindi belt. Why is that the case? Why are Konkani people so highly multilingual? Very, very high levels of multilingual. Generally, South is more multilingual than the North of India. Just to take example of India. So explaining this linguistic ecosystems becomes very, very essential, but unfortunately, we do not have enough discussions around this. We really focus on languages. Okay, so not only the number of languages or linguistic ecosystem, but what is the use one makes of languages. So a speaker of Marathi in Maharashtra and a speaker of Marathi, say in Indore, they have different uses of Marathi. Marathi stands for a different, Marathi has a different function in their lives. Okay, not only that, a person from a Kolhapur region would speak differently than a person from Pune region, I gather. And this difference is not only of grammatical difference, it's a difference of style, it's a difference. In Marathi, there's a word lakab. There's a way of speaking, the way we approach language, the way we approach a particular, the linguistic idiom itself is very different. So understanding these levels, so we know it intuitively, but it never becomes part of a discussion. It never becomes part of our descriptions about language. So understanding what languages are for becomes a very important component of our notion of linguistic diversity. An exclusive focus on language often leads us, or it misguides us. There's a very example which I have personally experienced. I studied a linguistic variety named Parushi, used by the Nathpanthi Dauri Gosavi community, or nomadic tribe, which travels throughout India. They are highly multilingual, correct? But they have this special variety which they use amongst themselves in presence of strangers. Very curious use of a linguistic variety. So when they are in presence of strangers, they would talk to each other in this variety. And we studied this variety in the department. What I realized is that this variety consists of around 150 to 200 words. And they represented what stands for negative connotations for that community. Threat from strangers, from police. So they use those words in those situations. And given the nomadic lifestyle, the constant exposure to danger, to threat, this is a very important resource which this community has developed. However, the grammatical structure of Parushi is exactly the same as Marathi. There is no difference I found. I tried very hard to look for differences. There is no difference. So a sentence like, there are a few Marathi speakers in this room, so I'll just try and explain this. So there's a sentence in Parushi, khapda khapda chingada ghasarla. Now, what does this mean? In Marathi, would say pada pada police aale. You see, all the grammatical elements are exactly that of Marathi. The words, the chingada word is different, ghasarla is different, and khapda. Khapda is actually made from pada. They have twisted the word pada into khapda. Okay, we do that. Children do that, right? They make their own languages. Something of that sort is happening. But chingada and ghasarla, ghasarli is to move. these words are opaque to the listener, but the grammatical structure is exactly that of Marathi. Now, when my informant is a highly educated person, and he said that this is our original language, which has been subsequently lost. And I tried to argue with him that this is not a language, which he got very upset about because he wanted to think of Parushi as a language of a particular community, which defines that community. And my own research tells me that this is a resource developed by the Nagpanthis within the domain of Marathi. Their mother tongue is Marathi, so they have used within the mother tongue, they have developed something very special with a very, very well-defined function. So but why is Parushi portrayed as a language? Because the model available to my informant is that of a language. So every community has a language, and that language many of these languages are in the face of are facing language laws. So that template is available to him, so that it easily fits into that template. But what we don't realize is that we are not looking at a language, but a difference within a language. And moreover, then I looked around, and there are many other nomadic communities which have their own Parushis. So Parushi, so there is Parushi of the Makadwalas, there is Parushi of the Nagpanthis, and there are many other Parushi of the Dome community. So there are many Parushis. So what is this Parushi? What does the word Parushi really mean? So it seems that Parushi is a name of a linguistic function, use of a particular set of words as a code, a secret code to talk to each other in presence of. And this awareness, this sort of perceptive awareness on the part of the community to name a linguistic function rather than a language is something very remarkable. And this also taught me to pay greater attention to articulations developed by communities over the centuries. What communities, how do the communities think about their languages? Traditionally, becomes a very important way in understanding linguistic diversity. An important aspect that what is also brought forth before me, that an important aspect of linguistic diversity is the functions which the various linguistic varieties perform. No multilingual user uses languages which he knows for the same purpose. So you all know at least 2 or 3 languages. You will observe that you use your languages 1, 2, and 3 for different purposes. There is very little overlap in the purpose for which we use the language. So we can plot the uses of language along a cline, and 2 poles of the cline is using of language for face-to-face communication, for general talk, for one-to-one talk, and use of language as a stage discourse, one-to-many. And characterizing these 2 poles of language are 2 models of linguistic description. One, which is language as a flow, where there are no sharp boundaries in linguistic varieties, and second is language as a discrete entity, language as an object. And what I wish to offer as a proposal is that mother tongues should always be understood as in the flow metaphor rather than the discrete object metaphor. Understanding mother tongue as a discrete object creates a lot of disfigurement of the linguistic reality we are part of. And interestingly, traditional wisdom, which has come from grassroots multilingualism, talks about these 2 conceptualizations of language. I think it is common across South Asia to say that our languages change every few kilometers, right? After so many kilometers, and we call it Boli. Boli is what we speak. And there is another concept of Shuddha Bhasha. Now, nowadays people talk about Shuddha Bhasha as pure language. It is not pure language. It is a language which is used for stage discourse, a language which has been explicitly, a language for which a grammar has explicitly been written or codified. So sharp boundaries have been marked in a planned fashion. That is what generally refers to Shuddha Marathi. Shuddha Marathi would be a Marathi for which there is a written grammar. Then there is Marathi for everyday use, which do not really differentiate from each other so sharply. And therefore, we can have each individual speaking differently, but yet we understand each other. So, and So this idea of a Boli and a Shuddha Bhasha. So Boli is a mother tongue or language of everyday communication. Shuddha Bhasha is a language which has a written grammar. The third concept which I find very commonly available in the everyday conceptualization of language is the notion of kshetra, or in Marathi we say patta, Konkan patta, Hindi patta. So we have this patta, and this patta is across what we say administrative boundaries. So this patta is typically a region which does not have sharp boundaries. So where we use patta, Konkan patta, where does Konkan patta start? Where does it end? We don't know, right? Where does the Hindi belt start? Where does it end? We know approximately, but we do not have sharp boundaries. And this is a very useful way of looking at mother tongues. Mother tongues belong to certain kshetras or pattas or diffused regions. Historically speaking, Shuddha Bhasha or language of stage discourse has developed through a patron-client relationship, and therefore and generally the client was the cultural elite of the region. As a result, the linguistic practices and the cultural practices of stage discourse of the elite were primarily the focus of development, which is, I think, in a way understandable, because the first person who make use of this patron-client relationship is the people who are in a position to make use. And through this developed aesthetics of textuality, the whole issue of how do we organize our text. So by text, I don't really mean written text or what is printed on paper. Anything which is used for stage discourse, one to many, is a text. So the order of textuality was described by aesthetics of the text, generally under Sanskrit for a long period of time, and after 19th century, it was a combination of English and Sanskrit, which decided what's a text, what's a good text, what's a proper text, what is appropriate for a particular situation and not appropriate for a particular. So these ideas of appropriateness come from the aesthetics of text. Now, because the cultural practices of the cultural elite were codified, at least initially, the tradition which created oral texts, who performed their texts, maybe ballads, shairs, poedas, or epics even, they were not really at the center of this codification. And this is an unfortunate marginalization of a majority of our texts in South Asia. But what is important to know is that linguistic identities in South Asia were never codified or never were never, what should I say, defined in terms of Shuddha Bhasha. They were always defined in terms of mother tongue or belonging to a particular patta or a particular kshetra. Thus, linguistic identity had all the characteristics of a Boli. It was deeply contextual and essentially fluid. So what is my linguistic identity? It depends upon the situation I am. In some situations, I become a Marathi speaker. In other situations, I become a Hindi speaker. In a different situation, I become an English speaker, and so on and so forth. So I don't have a fixed, rigid linguistic identity. It is deeply contextual and a fluid identity. That has been, so we do not have this kind of linguistic identification across the meaning. Now, with rise of nationalism in the 19th century, or in India, across the globe, but in India, the colonial state the colonial state wanted to create the colonial subject. In other places, the nation state wanted to create the citizen. So, in order to create the colonial subject or the citizen, whatever the case may be, one had to study the languages of the subject. So across 19th century, we observe across Europe, across India, people studying the spoken varieties, the countryside, languages of the countryside, moving beyond the standard varieties. But the model which they used to study these varieties were the models developed to study languages of stage discourse, which were rigid, fixed, decontextualized uses of language. So the model which linguistics has developed to study a language is not a model which is very suitable for the study of mother tongues, but it was used to study mother tongues. As a result, this notion of mother tongue became fixed, rigid. It acquired the characteristic of a discrete entity. So if you ask somebody what's your mother tongue, they always give you one answer today. Then you ask them, before going to school, how many languages did you learn? Then almost everybody I have asked gives 2 or 3 languages. So I said, how do you decide which one is your mother tongue? So there is this idea of a discrete entity and a one single fixed. So this mother tongue is getting fixed through this massive study of the diversity in India. In India, the Linguistic Survey of India conducted by Pearson is one such example. This is the transfer of conceptualization made from language of stage discourse to face-to-face communication, and as a result, mother tongues were refashioned. They were, and this was a unique development in the history of South Asia. Previously, all the described languages, such as Sanskrit, Prakrit, Apabhramshas, Deshis, Pishachis, we have a variety of languages which were described. They were all textual languages. They were languages of stage discourse. In the 19th century, for the first time, mother tongue started being studied, but with the methodology of languages of stage discourse. As a result, we have a very unique situation. You ask anybody, for example, does Hindi have dialects? Does Marathi have dialects? Everybody says yes. Linguists would say yes. How many? Nobody gives an answer. There is no answer to this question. Is it because we do not know enough about our dialects, or is it because this question cannot be answered? My submission is that this question cannot be answered because you cannot count mother tongues. Linguistic, the census tells us we have 10,000 mother tongues. If you ask more deeply, you'll get 1 lakh, because what we are looking at is a flow of linguistic resources or linguistic properties across a region. How do we make a cut that this is where one thing starts and this is where the other thing ends? So now mother tongues were understood in terms of dialects which had properties of stage discourse, and this, I think, is a false assumption. It's a false assumption that you can actually count a number of dialects, or for that matter, number of mother tongues. What these surveys or what linguists study are basically taking a snapshot of a flow. So there is a flow of linguistic properties, and when we go to a particular village or a particular town and we record something, we are taking a snapshot of something which is essentially moving. And these snapshots are extremely valuable. I'm not really denigrating them, because we know what is happening. We get a fair idea of what is happening in different regions. But to forget that they are snapshots and to treat the snapshot as the whole picture is really a category mistake. And this is the monolingual bias which linguistic methodology or the methodology of the state has brought, has imposed upon a mother tongue. As a consequence of this bias or this imposition of a monolingual methodology on essentially a multilingual situation, we now view multilingual regions as a unilingual one, or a region where majority speak a particular dialect. And this, I think, is the root of majoritarianism. My previous speaker talked about it. But where are the roots? Why did majoritarianism gain so much, so much support? Because now we are looking at what is essentially a flow as a discrete entity. Once it is discrete entity, who are the owners of the discrete entity? The majority of the speakers of that region. And understanding linguistic communities in isolation and treating cultural or interaction with other communities or other people in the region as something external, something which does not define the community, really stagnates, solidifies, or fossilizes what is essentially a fluid phenomenon. I'll give an example. Right? I said that I want to Okay, I'll try and conclude. I'll just give the example of Banjara. Banjara wanted their language to be included in the 8th schedule. The way they postulated it, because Banjara is a variety of speakers, there is no one Banjara community, right? So, what they did is they located the unity of Banjara at a previous stage. That we, in the past, we were one. And our culture, because our language is one, our culture is one. Equation of language with culture. The moment we equate language with culture, so one language, one culture is one language, one community, one culture. The next step is very simple: one language, one community, one culture, one nation. So what we really need to understand is that this shift which was brought about, how do we understand this shift? The shift over the past 2 centuries is a shift in the role of mother tongues from a low-key instrumental value. The various mother tongues which I learned had an instrumental value. It was useful resource for me to speak at home, speak in the market, speak with my friends. Now it has become a high-key defining function. My mother tongue defines me, my person, who I am in a very static. And therefore, these orientations, there are 2 orientations towards mother tongue. So now we have a fixed, rigid tradition in the name of a mother tongue. Some people reject it, some people use it in a revivalist fashion. But the underground, dynamics remains the same. So before concluding, I would like to add 2 comments. One is that people who promote progressive values of pluralism, multiculturalism, to make this sort of reduction of language with community. They do not, the moment you relate language with culture and community, the reduction has already been made. Whether you respect that difference or whether you want that to throw out the people, that is of course an important value which we have, but the underlying understanding is common. So across ideologies, we share much more than we differ on. That is the point which I want to make. So in conclusion, just one more minute I would take, is that the monolingual approach adopted by the state while appropriating the mother tongue has brought a change in linguistic attitudes and patterns of language use. The state is always trying to penetrate deeper and deeper into the countryside to create and exploit markets. And that has resulted in a gigantic shift in the way we approach our mother tongues. And language loss and language shifts are the strengthening of revivalist tendencies are some of the effects of this shift. And stemming this tide would require a strong will and a lot of effort on the part of the polity. And part of this effort would involve revisiting our conceptualizations regarding linguistic diversity. And we as intellectual workers should listen much more to the voices which emerge from grassroots multilingualism, multilingual experiences of South Asia, in order to come up with a more viable, more sustainable solutions to the linguistic crisis which we are facing. Thank you, and I'm sorry about extending my time.